What if one of the most accurate commentaries on our world today wasn't written yesterday, but thousands of years ago? The Book of Amos reads less like ancient history and more like a mirror held up to modern life. It reveals a society that looked successful on the surface, but was quietly breaking underneath, where justice was ignored, truth was softened, and faith became disconnected from real life. In this journey, we uncover how those same patterns still exist today, how comfort can replace conviction, how alignment can drift into assumption, and how small compromises can shape entire outcomes. But more than that, Amos offers something powerful, a chance to recognize the pattern before it's too late, and to choose a different direction. Because the message isn't just about what went wrong, it's about what can still be made right. When ancient words feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we step into Amos, take a breath and consider something unsettling. What if the most accurate commentary on today's world wasn't written yesterday, but thousands of years ago? The first time I read the Book of Amos slowly, not skimming, not rushing, just letting it speak. At first it felt distant, ancient, agricultural, names and places that seemed far removed from modern life. But then something shifted, the tone changed, and suddenly it didn't feel ancient anymore. It felt like a headline. It felt like scrolling through news on a phone at midnight. It felt like watching a world unravel while everyone pretends everything is fine. Because Amos doesn't begin with comfort, he begins with confrontation, not directed at enemies first, but at God's own people. And that's where it starts to feel personal. Amos was not a priest, not a prophet by training. He was a shepherd, a fig tree farmer, someone ordinary until God asked him to speak an extraordinary message. And what he saw is what makes this book feel so current. He looked at a nation that was thriving on the surface, economically stable, religiously active, culturally confident. But underneath, something was breaking. Justice was being traded for profit. Truth was being softened to maintain comfort. Worship was still happening, but it had become disconnected from obedience. Does that sound familiar? There's a moment early in Amos where judgment is pronounced, not just on foreign nations, but eventually on Israel itself. And the shock isn't just that judgment is coming, it's why. Not because they stopped being religious, but because their religion became empty. They were still gathering, still singing, still offering sacrifices, but the way they treated people, especially the vulnerable, told a different story. And here's the tension Amos forces us to sit with. What if outward faithfulness can exist alongside inward corruption? What if a society can look blessed while quietly drifting away from what actually matters? That question doesn't stay in ancient Israel. It follows us into our cities, into our churches, into our daily lives. Because Amos is not just describing a moment in history, he's exposing a pattern where success masks decay, where comfort dulls conviction, where spiritual language continues but spiritual sensitivity fades. And maybe the most unsettling part? The people didn't see it. They believed they were fine. They believed their prosperity meant approval. Their activity meant alignment. Their comfort meant blessing. But Amos steps into that illusion like a storm breaking a silent sky, and he says, "You've missed it. Not because you abandoned God, but because you reshaped him into something more convenient." That's what makes this book feel like today's news. Because we live in a world where information is constant, but discernment is rare, where voices are loud, but truth is often diluted, where it's possible to feel spiritually engaged while being spiritually unaware. So the question begins to form. Are we recognizing the same patterns Amos saw, or are we too close to it to see it clearly? Because the Book of Amos doesn't just inform, it reveals. And if we're willing to listen, not defensively, not distantly, but honestly, it might show us something about our world, and something even more personal. It might show us ourselves. When justice is ignored, everything else cracks. Before we go deeper, let's steady ourselves, because this is where Amos sharpens. This is where the message moves from observation to exposure. And what he reveals isn't complicated. It's uncomfortable in its simplicity. I've always found it striking how Amos doesn't begin with theology. He begins with behavior. Not abstract doctrine, but lived reality. Because in Amos, what people do becomes the clearest evidence of what they truly believe. And what he sees is a society that has mastered the art of appearing right, while living wrong. They have systems, they have structure, they have success, but something essential has been quietly removed: justice. Not the kind that's talked about, but the kind that's practiced. Amos describes people being sold for trivial amounts, the poor being trampled, the vulnerable being exploited in ways that are both subtle and systemic. And what makes it heavier is this: it's not chaos causing the damage. It's normal life, business as usual, transactions, decisions, conversations, all happening within a culture that has learned how to justify what it should confront. And suddenly, Amos is no longer just speaking to ancient Israel. He's holding up a mirror, because we understand this world, a world where people can be overlooked because they're inconvenient, where success can come at the expense of someone else's dignity, where systems can function efficiently, while quietly producing injustice, and yet everything still looks stable. That's the tension Amos presses into, because in his world, and in ours, prosperity can create a dangerous illusion, the illusion that everything is okay, because everything is working. But Amos challenges that assumption. He forces a deeper question: what if things are working, but not right? What if success has become a disguise? There's a moment in Amos where God rejects the worship of the people, not because they stopped worshiping, but because their worship became disconnected from how they lived. Songs were still being sung, offerings were still being given, gatherings were still happening. But the way they treated others, especially those without power, contradicted everything those acts were supposed to represent. And then comes one of the most powerful lines in the entire book. Not loud, not complex, but piercing. A call for justice to roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. It's not a suggestion, it's a standard, and it reframes everything. Because suddenly faith is no longer measured by activity, it's measured by alignment. Not what we say, but what flows from us. Not what we perform, but what we produce. And that's where it gets personal. Because it's possible to be involved without being transformed. It's possible to participate without actually reflecting what we claim to believe. And Amos refuses to let that disconnect go unnoticed. He exposes another theme that runs quietly beneath the surface: complacency. A kind of spiritual sleep that doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like comfort. People in Amos's time weren't necessarily trying to reject God. They had just grown used to a version of life where he was no longer central. He became assumed, background, a part of the culture but not the driver of it. And here's the danger. Complacency doesn't announce itself, it drifts in, slowly, through small compromises, through quiet justifications, through the subtle shift from conviction to convenience, until one day, the question isn't whether we believe, it's whether our belief still shapes us. Amos speaks into that drift with urgency, not because change is impossible, but because time is often underestimated. There's a rhythm in the book, a repetition of warnings, calls to return, moments where correction is still within reach, but they're often ignored, not out of defiance, but out of delay. We'll deal with it later. We're still doing enough. It's not that serious. And that's where the weight of Amos begins to settle, because the issue isn't just what's happening externally, it's what's happening internally. A gradual desensitization, a loss of awareness, a quiet reshaping of priorities. And by the time it becomes visible, it's already been happening for a long time. So the question rises again, sharper this time. Where are we assuming everything is fine? Simply because nothing has collapsed yet? Where have we allowed comfort to replace clarity? Because Amos isn't just pointing out problems, he's revealing a pattern, one that repeats whenever truth is softened and justice is postponed. And if we're willing to listen closely, we might begin to recognize that pattern, not just in the world around us, but in the places we rarely examine, the visions that reveal what words cannot. This is where Amos stops simply speaking and begins showing. This is where the message shifts from explanation to imagery. And the images he's given aren't random. They're precise, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. I've noticed something about how truth reaches us. Sometimes we can hear something clearly and still not feel it. But when we see it, when it takes shape, when it becomes visual, it settles differently. It lingers. That's what happens in Amos. God doesn't just describe what's wrong. He gives Amos visions, not to confuse, but to clarify. And each one pulls back another layer of what's really happening beneath the surface. The first vision feels almost distant at first, a swarm of locusts consuming everything in its path, not rushing, not chaotic, just thorough, field by field, layer by layer, leaving nothing behind. And the unsettling part isn't just the destruction, it's the inevitability of it. There's no urgency in the image, because it doesn't need it. It's already in motion, already happening. And suddenly it's not just about agriculture, it's about erosion, the kind that happens quietly, gradually, where things don't collapse all at once, but are slowly eaten away, until what once stood strong is no longer recognizable. Have you ever seen that kind of erosion in real life? Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady. A relationship that weakens over time, a conviction that slowly fades, a standard that gets adjusted, just a little at a time, until one day you look back and realize something important has been lost, and you can't even point to the exact moment it happened. That's the locust vision. Not chaos, but quiet consumption. And then comes the next image, fire. Not a small flame, but something deep, consuming even the foundations. It's not just surface-level damage. It reaches down into what holds everything together. And that's what makes it more intense. Because surface problems can be managed. They can be covered, repaired, reframed. But when the foundation is affected, everything becomes unstable. Amos is being shown that what's happening isn't just behavioral, it's structural. Something deeper is being compromised. Something that, if left unaddressed, will eventually affect everything above it. And again, the question presses in. What foundations are we assuming are solid without ever examining them? What beliefs, what values, what systems? Have we stopped questioning simply because they've always been there? Then comes one of the most precise and revealing visions of all. A plumb line, simple, almost ordinary. A tool used to measure whether a wall is straight, whether it's aligned, whether it can stand. And in this moment, everything becomes clear. God isn't comparing people to each other. He's measuring them against a standard, not shifting, not negotiable, steady. And what the plumb line reveals is that things are not as aligned as they appear. From a distance, the wall may look fine, strong, stable, even impressive, but up close, measured accurately, it's off. And here's what makes this vision so powerful. The issue isn't visibility, it's alignment. Because something can look right and still be wrong. Something can function and still be off-center. And that realization cuts deeper than any accusation, because it removes comparison. It removes excuse. It replaces opinion with truth. And suddenly the question isn't, how do I look? It becomes, how do I measure? That's what Amos is revealing through these visions. Not just behavior, not just outcomes, but alignment with something unchanging. And then comes one of the most haunting images, a basket of ripe fruit. At first it feels almost peaceful, complete, full, ready, but the meaning underneath is sobering. Ripe means finished. A season has reached its end. An opportunity has been fully extended, and now what remains is consequence. It's not about sudden judgment, it's about completed time. And that might be one of the most difficult truths to sit with, because we often assume there will always be more time, more chances, more opportunities. But Amos quietly confronts that assumption. Not harshly, but clearly. There is a point where delay is no longer neutral, where waiting becomes choosing, where silence becomes response. And finally, there's one more image. Not visual, but experiential. A famine, not of food, but of hearing truth. A silence where clarity once existed, where people search, but cannot find. Not because truth disappeared, but because it was ignored for too long. And now its absence is felt, deeply. That image lingers, because it's not about punishment, it's about loss. The loss of guidance, the loss of clarity, the loss of something that was once available, but no longer embraced. And the question it leaves us with is quiet, but heavy. What voices are we tuning out now, that we may one day wish we had listened to? Because the visions of Amos aren't just symbolic. They're diagnostic. They reveal what's happening beneath the surface, before it becomes visible. And if we're willing to sit with them, not rush past them, they begin to uncover something deeper, not just about a nation long ago, but about the patterns that still unfold today. When the message stops being distant, pause here, because this is where the distance disappears. This is where Amos is no longer something we observe, but something we begin to apply. Take a moment and let this settle, because this is where the distance disappears. What we've been exploring can no longer remain something we observe from the outside. This is where the message of Amos moves out of history and into the present, where it begins to intersect with real decisions, real habits, and real lives. I remember the moment it stopped feeling like someone else's story. It wasn't ancient Israel anymore, and it wasn't a distant warning meant for another time. It became something closer, something uncomfortably familiar. Because it's easy to engage with a message like Amos on a surface level, to agree with it, to recognize the patterns in the world around us, and to walk away unchanged. But the weight of this book doesn't settle until it becomes personal, until it shifts from recognition into reflection. Amos doesn't just confront systems or expose cultures. It brings attention to patterns that form in everyday life. These are not dramatic failures or obvious acts of rebellion. They are quiet, often unnoticed shifts that take place in routine decisions and repeated behaviors. Most people do not intentionally drift away from what is right. They do not wake up with the goal of disconnecting belief from behavior. Instead, the shift happens gradually, through small compromises, subtle justifications, and moments where convenience feels easier than conviction. Over time, those small decisions begin to shape direction. And direction, even when it seems insignificant, always leads somewhere. That is where the message becomes practical. It forces a question we rarely stop to ask. Where has alignment been replaced with assumption? Where have we started believing that because things seem generally fine, they must actually be right? Drift does not usually appear in obvious failure. It hides in unexamined patterns, in the places where we stop paying attention, because nothing feels urgent enough to confront. This plays out in ways that are easy to overlook. It shows up in how we treat people when there is nothing to gain, in the conversations we avoid because they are uncomfortable, and in the decisions we justify because they seem normal within the culture around us. It appears in moments where we sense something is off, but convince ourselves that it is not significant enough to address. Left unchecked, those moments accumulate, and what once felt like a small misalignment slowly becomes a settled direction. Amos does not allow those patterns to remain hidden. It brings them into the light, not to shame, but to create clarity. And that clarity is what makes change possible. Without it, we continue moving forward without realizing where we are actually headed. With it, we are given the opportunity to pause, to examine, and to make intentional adjustments before the consequences of those patterns fully unfold. There is a shift that happens when faith moves, from something we associate with to something we actively express. It is no longer defined by participation alone, but by alignment. Not in grand, visible moments, but in consistent, everyday choices. It becomes evident in how we respond when we are wrong, in how we choose integrity when it costs us something, and in how we treat others when there is no recognition attached to it. These are the places where belief either becomes real or remains theoretical. This is also where honesty becomes essential. Not a surface-level acknowledgement, but a deeper willingness to examine what is actually shaping our lives. It requires asking difficult questions without immediately trying to soften the answers. Where am I out of alignment? Where have I normalized something that should be questioned? Where have I chosen comfort over truth? And perhaps most importantly, am I willing to respond when I see it? That last question is where everything turns. Awareness alone does not create change. It is possible to recognize what is wrong and still continue in the same direction. But response interrupts that pattern. It prevents desensitization. It keeps awareness from becoming something we ignore over time. Each response, even a small one, begins to shift direction. And over time, those shifts rebuild alignment in ways that are both steady and lasting. In a world filled with constant information, constant opinions, and constant noise, reflection has become increasingly rare. There is always something else to focus on, something else to consume, something else to distract. But without intentional reflection, it becomes easy to keep moving without ever asking whether the direction itself is right. Amos invites us into that pause, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to recalibrate. What makes this message hopeful is that change does not require everything to be fixed at once. It begins with acknowledgement. It begins the moment we stop avoiding what we already sense and choose to address it. Even in small ways, those small responses matter more than they seem, because they shift trajectory. They begin to restore what may have quietly drifted, and they create a foundation for something more stable moving forward. The question that remains is not distant or abstract. It is immediate and personal. What is one area right now where alignment is being invited? Not in a distant future or under better circumstances, but in the present. Because the message of Amos is not only about recognizing what goes wrong, it is about responding while there is still time to make it right. When awareness becomes decision, take a breath before this final step. Because this is where everything converges. What began as observation moved into recognition, and then into reflection. And now it arrives at a moment that cannot stay theoretical. This is where the message of Amos stops informing and starts asking something of us. I remember finishing the Book of Amos and sitting in silence longer than I expected. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. And that understanding carried weight. It wasn't just about what happened to a nation long ago. It was about what happens to any people, any culture, and any individual, who slowly replaces alignment with assumption and conviction with comfort. That realization doesn't pass quickly. It lingers, because it moves the message out of history and into the present. That is what makes Amos so enduring. It doesn't expire, and it doesn't belong to one moment in time. It resurfaces wherever the same patterns begin to form. If we are honest, those patterns are not difficult to recognize today. They show up in systems that prioritize efficiency over people, in conversations where truth is softened to avoid discomfort, and in environments where appearance is carefully maintained, while deeper issues remain unaddressed. What makes it more sobering is how normal it all feels while it is happening. But the most important place those patterns appear is not in systems or culture first. It is in the quiet, unnoticed areas of our own lives. It is in the places where we sense something is slightly off, but have learned how to live with it. It is in the small compromises that never feel urgent enough to confront, and in the subtle ways we convince ourselves that things are close enough to being right. Over time, those small allowances begin to shape direction. And direction, even when it feels insignificant, always leads somewhere. Amos does not just expose those areas. It brings us face to face with a decision. Once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. And once it is seen, it quietly demands a response. That response is not about perfection or sudden transformation. It is not about fixing everything at once or creating a dramatic external shift overnight. The kind of transformation Amos points toward is far more grounded than that. It begins with alignment, with bringing what we believe back into connection with how we actually live. That kind of alignment requires a level of honesty that goes deeper than surface reflection. It requires the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truth, without immediately trying to explain it away. It asks us to choose clarity over convenience, even when that choice costs something. And that is where most people hesitate. Not because they do not understand what is right, but because they understand exactly what it might require. There is a moment in Amos where everything feels like it has reached its limit. where the weight of consequence seems final. Yet even there is an underlying truth that changes how we see the entire message. The purpose was never destruction. It was always restoration. The warnings were not given to push people away, but to call them back. That is what gives this message its depth, because it reveals both the seriousness of misalignment and the possibility of return. The same clarity that exposes where things are off also creates the opportunity to realign them. The same awareness that reveals drift gives us the chance to change direction. That is where this becomes personal in the most meaningful way. Not as a burden, but as an invitation. It is an invitation to pay attention again, to care about the areas we have overlooked, and to bring integrity back into the places where it has quietly faded. What makes that invitation powerful is that it does not require a perfect starting point. It only requires a willing one. Transformation does not begin when everything is already in order. It begins the moment we stop ignoring what we already know. It begins when we choose to respond instead of delay, even in small ways that may not feel significant in the moment, but carry weight over time. So the question that remains is simple, but it is not small. What will you do with what you have seen? Not in theory, not in intention, but in practice. Where will you choose alignment over assumption? Where will you allow conviction to replace comfort? Where will you respond instead of waiting for a more convenient moment? These questions do not demand immediate dramatic answers, but they shape direction. And direction over time determines everything. The reason the message of Amos reads like today's news is because human nature has not changed. The same tendencies, the same patterns, and the same drift still exist. But the opportunity it presents is just as present now as it was then. It is the opportunity to recognize the pattern before it fully unfolds, to respond before consequences become unavoidable, and to realign before what is slightly off becomes deeply broken. That is the transformation Amos ultimately points toward. It is not just about seeing clearly, but about choosing differently. It is not just about recognizing truth, but about living in it. It is not just about hearing the message, but becoming the response.